Hi, this is Rob. Welcome to the final video in the Cumulus Cycles LAMP stack tutorial playlist. In this video, we'll retrieve contacts data from the MySQL database we created in the last video and use it to dynamically populate the contacts page in our application. This is going to be fun, so let's jump in. First, we'll go to MAMP and launch the Web Start page. Then we'll expand the MySQL section. Here, we see the information that we need to connect our application to our database. And here's some sample code. To get us started, I created a DB folder in the includes folder in our application. I copied this sample connection code and pasted it into a file named config.php. So here we're declaring a function to be executed called getConnection. And all a function is a block of code that's executed when you call the function, which will, in this case, return a result. So when I call the getConnection function, I'm declaring some PHP variables. The first one is the variable to hold the path to the host where the database server is running, and that's localhost port 8889. The username for the MySQL database is root, and the password is also root. The database that we want to access is called my_contacts. So if we go back to PHP myadmin, the name of our database is mycontacts. The table is contacts. So back in the config, I'm going to create a new connection to that database, passing it the values that we declared in the variables. Then we check to see if there's an error, and if there is, we'll just echo the error message out to the page and then exit. If the connection is successful, we will return it to the code that's calling the function. And in this case, the code that's calling the function is in a new file that I created in the DB folder named contacts.php. Now this file has a function called getContacts, which when called will create a variable which is set to the result of calling the getConnection function in the config. So when this code executes, it will go to the config. The config will create a new connection to the database, and if all goes well, return it. So in contacts, I now have a connection to the database, which I'll check to ensure that I have. And if all went well, again, we'll create a variable called contacts, which will be an array. And this array is a data type that will hold a collection of values. So it's still a variable, but instead of holding a string like hello world or a number like 10, it will hold a collection of values. Then I create a variable called SQL for structured query language. It's the query that I want to execute against the database, and in this case we want to select star, so select everything from the contacts table. We have a variable called result that is the result of executing the SQL statement on the connection to the database. So after this executes the select star from contacts query, we'll check to see if a response came back. If not, we just kill the app. Else, if we did get the response back, we will loop through the response, and each time through, go to the contacts array and add a new row. Now I know the arrays and the looping are more advanced than the PHP that we looked at previously in this playlist, but I just want to walk through this implementation so you see how we can get data from the database and then utilize it in our code to dynamically display the content. As previously mentioned in a prior video, the JavaScript playlist in my channel will take a deep dive into computer programming. But for now, this loop, the while loop, while we have rows of data, we'll take the row and put it in the contacts array. When we no longer have any more results from the database, so we've looped through the result of selecting all from contacts, we'll close the connection to the database and then return the contacts. So in order to start this processing to get contacts and get a connection and query the database and then loop through the results and return them, we need to call the get contacts function. And that will be done in the contacts page. So the first thing I need to do is add two PHP includes to include the config file and the contacts file. Now, just to make sure we don't have any errors, let's save this code and go back to the browser and refresh our page. And we see exactly the same result as we did previously. So at least we know we are connecting to the database. The credentials that we passed for the host, the database name, the user, and password values are correct. So we're off to a good start. Now what we need to do is get the results of calling the get contacts and loop through them to dynamically create the cards on our contacts page. So I'm going to start out by deleting our second and third row of contacts. Because we don't need them hard-coded anymore, we're going to dynamically create each card using the data that comes back from the database. I'm also going to delete the two divs for our second and third contacts. So right now, we just have one row with one contact. And if we go back to the browser and refresh the page, that's what we see. So remember, at the top of this page, we have our two PHP includes. The contacts uses the config to make a connection to the database so we can execute the query. The contacts has the get contacts function that we want to call from the contacts PHP to get the results so we can loop through it and build these cards. So we'll start off doing that by adding some PHP code. And what this code does is it creates a variable named contacts, which calls the get contacts function, which will return our contacts. Now what we want to do is loop through those contacts that were returned by executing the SQL statement against the database. And we'll do that with a for each statement in PHP. So what this says is for each row that was returned that's in the variable contacts, create a new variable named contact that I could then use inside of the loop to reference the data from that row. But before we do that, I simply want to echo out a card for the number of contacts that are in the database. Now, this should be the same card because the values are still hard-coded, but I'm going to have one of these cards for every row that was in the database. And if all went well, we should have returned 9 rows from the database, so we should see 9 of these cards, all for Stacy. So let's jump back in the browser and refresh the page. Although we do see multiple cards, there's clearly something wrong with the layout. So let's jump back in the code and see what I did wrong. All right, so let's start at the top. We have our section and we have a row. Then inside of that, for each row that we returned from the database, we're going to echo a new div to start our card. So let me just format this a little better so we could take a look. Okay, so here's the parent div. And if we work our way in, this is the innermost div that has the card body, the title, and a couple other paragraphs. Then that div and the image is wrapped inside the div with the card. And then this closing div closes the column. So it looks like I have an extra div here. So let's get rid of that and save it. Now, this is the column inside of the row. So if we go back to the row and come down, it looks like we're missing a closing div before the section. So we'll add that, and I don't think we need these either. So let's save this and take a look at what it looks like in the browser now. And that's better. So we have 3 rows with 3 cards, and that's the 9 rows that we returned from the database. Of course, again, we're only seeing Stacy because the values are hard-coded. So the final thing we need to do is go in and modify this code that's being echoed out to concatenate to the code the values from the individual contact that we're working with. And this is the code that will do that. So each time through the for each loop, we're going to create a new variable called the contact. And that's going to be equal to the current contact that we're getting in the loop. Then when we echo the HTML, we're going to concatenate to it the value of going to the current contact into its array and getting the element at the 0th position. Now, again, I know arrays are a little more advanced than what we've covered so far, but remember, an array is a collection of values, and each element in the array is at a certain position. And in the case of PHP, the first position in the array is a 0. So what I'm doing is I'm dynamically building the source attribute for the image by hard coding the image folder / contact underscore and then appending the contact 0, which is the ID. Because when we select star from contact table, the first value that's returned for each row is the ID. And if we look in the image folder, the images are all named contact underscore and then using the ID of that contact. So when this code here executes, the source attribute will be equal to img / contact underscore. The first row in the database has an ID of 1.png, so that's this contact. And then we're setting the alt value equal to the contact 1, which is the name, because that's the second column in the database. We again access the contact name for the card title, the email address for the email paragraph, and then finally the last element in the array for this contact is the cell phone. So if we save this and go back to the browser and refresh, now we have all of our contacts displayed with the data coming from the database. So that wraps up this LAMP stack tutorial playlist. Thanks for sticking with me through it. I know we started getting into some programming concepts here, and I hope you're excited to continue your learning and join me in the JavaScript playlist on the Cumulus Cycles channel to take a deeper dive into software development.